3 months ago, 15 board members from the Clearwater Ridge Community Association gathered outside a rusted gate at the end of a narrow canyon road, insisting that the woman on the other side grant them access to the only direct route through her property. They carried folders stuffed with printouts. They threatened legal action they had no actual standing to pursue, and they claimed jurisdiction over an entire hillside that had never belonged to anyone but her family. The woman stood in her doorway above them, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier, and delivered one response that would spread through 4 townships before summer ended. Not happening, not ever, they scoffed. A few of them actually scoffed, the particular sound people make when they believe the outcome has already been decided in their favor. What they failed to understand was that every foot of that canyon passage had been owned by one family for 65 years, through floods and fires and one deeply rooted refusal to bend under outside pressure. They failed to understand that recording devices were already running from 3 separate angles, capturing every word, every gesture, every baseless claim that would eventually be replayed before a magistrate. And they certainly failed to understand that their own association president, the man who had sent them up that hillside with such absolute confidence, was about to dismantle his entire operation with his own careless arrogance. Claire Donovan was 52 years old, and she had lived on Redstone Canyon for nearly all of those years, in a house her grandfather constructed with timber hauled by hand before any paved road reached the area. Her family had owned that land since the late 1950s, back when nobody in the region wanted canyon property because canyon property flooded unpredictably and offered none of the flat stability that farmers valued. Her grandfather, Thomas Donovan, had carved the passage himself over 2 brutal summers, breaking rock with a pickaxe until his shoulders ached for days afterward, because he refused to drive an extra 35 miles just to reach the northern edge of the region for basic supplies. That narrow dirt track, later widened and reinforced with gravel hauled up in a borrowed dump truck, became the only private connector linking the upper canyon to the lower valley, and it remained unused by outsiders for decades because nobody else ever needed it. Thomas used to say the canyon taught you patience whether you wanted the lesson or not. And Claire grew up believing that entirely, the same way she believed morning fog would settle into the low places every single day without asking anyone's permission first. Claire grew up watching her grandfather work that land with a kind of deliberate care that seemed excessive to strangers and seemed essential to anyone who truly understood the terrain. She remembered being 10 years old, watching him rebuild a retaining wall for the 4th time in a single month after heavy rains kept washing it downhill, never once cursing the weather or the slope or the stubborn ground beneath it. After Thomas passed quietly one spring morning, Claire maintained the same careful routines he had established because altering even the smallest detail felt like erasing him from the canyon completely. Mornings were for the chickens, a small flock of heritage breeds that produced more eggs than she could reasonably use herself. Afternoons were for repairing whatever the weather had damaged overnight, usually the old irrigation line her grandfather installed decades earlier and somehow kept functional through sheer stubborn maintenance. Evenings belonged to the front porch, to stillness, to tea gone lukewarm from sitting too long on the railing, and to watching ravens glide lazy circles above the ridge as shadows stretched long across distant rock faces. She gardened modestly in the warmer months, cleared brush in the cooler ones, and wanted nothing from the outside world except to be left alone on the land her grandfather had carved from stone and resilient juniper. There was a particular morning, years before any trouble surfaced, when a wildlife officer wandered up looking for a trail marker and ended up staying for lunch simply because Claire offered without hesitation. That was the nature of the canyon, the kind of life Claire had built within it, where strangers became visitors and visitors sometimes became familiar faces who returned every few seasons just to check how the chickens were managing. Nothing about that quiet existence demanded anything from the valley below, and nothing about it expected the valley to demand anything in return. For years that understanding held perfectly. The valley below remained mostly rural, scattered with a few small farms and one general store that closed reliably at sunset, operated by a woman who recognized everyone's vehicle by its particular engine rattle. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, construction vehicles started appearing on the lower roads. Survey flags started appearing in fields that used to grow alfalfa, and one spring, Claire watched from her ridge as excavators began clearing ground at the canyon's base. Something new was arriving in the valley, something backed by serious capital, and capital has a peculiar tendency to look up at quiet hillsides and see nothing but wasted potential waiting to be developed. That something became Clearwater Ridge Community, a gated development designed for people who wanted canyon views without any of the actual canyon hardship that accompanied them. Within 18 months, the community stood completed, with custom homes arranged along winding asphalt streets, a recreation center with panoramic windows overlooking an artificial lake, and wrought iron entrance gates stamped with a crest that looked prestigious because every element of it had cost accordingly. Affluent buyers from urban centers purchased quickly, attracted by promises of clean air, exclusive trails, and the specific kind of tranquility that only wealth can reliably guarantee. At the helm stood Marcus Brennan, the elected president of the Clearwater Ridge Community Association, a man who had constructed his entire professional reputation around dominance, presentation, and the absolute conviction that money resolved every conflict eventually, given sufficient time and leverage. Marcus managed the association the way some people manage corporations, with subcommittees, penalties for unauthorized landscaping choices, and a manner of speaking that implied disagreement was merely a temporary misunderstanding of his superior vision. He had grown up believing that assertiveness alone could shift nearly anything, and throughout most of his career, that belief had proven remarkably accurate. Before Clearwater Ridge existed, Marcus had spent nearly 2 decades in commercial real estate development across the state, advancing from junior analyst to executive vice president through relentless determination, and an unshakable confidence that every obstacle was simply a negotiation he had not yet dominated. When the developer behind Clearwater Ridge offered him the founding association presidency, he viewed it as his opportunity to finally create something entirely under his control, a community molded completely by his standards and his particular definition of what canyon living should represent. He approached the position the same way he approached everything else, with documentation, detailed projections, and an absolute certainty that thorough planning could overcome virtually any inconvenience geography happened to present. The development had one persistent weakness that no promotional materials ever acknowledged, a weakness that became impossible to dismiss once actual crises began occurring with measurable consequences. The only public access into Clearwater Ridge wound 12 additional miles around the canyon's base, which meant emergency vehicles took too long, medical transport took too long, and the heavy equipment required for the community's next expansion phase took far too long for Marcus's rapidly diminishing tolerance. It did not take his planning team long to identify the obvious alternative sitting directly above their development, a graded canyon passage that connected straight to the northern valley, reducing transit time to nearly nothing. That passage naturally was Claire Donovan's private road, built by her grandfather's own blistered hands, located entirely on land deeded to the Donovan family decades before Clearwater Ridge was even a concept in some planner's imagination. Marcus studied the survey maps, noted the name on the property records, and assumed this would be a straightforward, barely memorable discussion. An aging woman alone on a hillside, he figured, would be grateful that someone influential had finally bothered to approach her directly. He made the initial visit himself, dressed for a corporate boardroom rather than a gravel canyon track, his polished shoes collecting dust as he approached Claire's porch carrying a leather portfolio full of proposals and financial projections. He offered her a substantial sum for an easement through her land, a figure he described confidently as more than fair, presented as something any sensible person would accept without prolonged consideration. Claire listened quietly, finished the last of her tea, and told him the same thing she would repeat consistently for months following. The exact phrase that would eventually be cited verbatim in legal proceedings. Not happening, not ever. Marcus smiled the specific way people smile when they feel disrespected but choose not to reveal it immediately, thanked her for her time with rehearsed courtesy, and walked back down the hillside already deciding privately that she would reconsider soon enough. He had not built a community association through gentle requests and patient diplomacy, and he certainly did not plan to allow one canyon resident to permanently obstruct his members from basic accessibility. In his assessment, this conversation had not represented a refusal at all. It was merely the opening position in a negotiation he fully anticipated winning with absolute certainty. The correspondence started arriving within 10 days, printed cleanly on association letterhead with phrasing clearly drafted by attorneys who charged meticulously by the quarter hour. Each letter restated the identical demand in progressively more formal and progressively more intimidating language, reframing access to Claire's Road as a matter of community welfare rather than simple private convenience for wealthy homeowners. When the letters generated no response beyond calm, deliberate silence, Marcus escalated rapidly to formal legal counsel, dispatching a demand letter that accused Claire of obstructing emergency response to an entire residential development, despite the undeniable fact that her road had never been offered to anyone outside her own family. Claire did not panic, because panic had never resolved a single meaningful problem on that canyon in 65 years of family stewardship. Instead, she drove into the county seat and retrieved every document she could locate regarding her family's property, beginning with the original deed recorded in 1958, the precise year her grandfather first registered the parcel officially. She found tax receipts proving decades of continuous, documented ownership, boundary surveys confirming the exact limits of the passage, and historical county records that designated the road as private from its very inception. She duplicated everything 3 times, storing the copies in 3 different locations. One in a fireproof safe at the house, one with her attorney downtown, and one with a trusted friend 2 counties away, because a woman who grew up watching her grandfather defend this land naturally understood the enduring importance of documentation. When the association realized that financial offers and stern legal correspondence were not moving her whatsoever, Marcus shifted his entire strategy, transitioning from measured pressure into something considerably harsher. Fresh letters arrived warning that Claire's obstinate refusal endangered the welfare of families, vulnerable residents, and emergency personnel. Language clearly crafted less for her and far more for anyone who might eventually see it reproduced in media coverage. Around the same period, Claire began noticing unfamiliar vehicles idling near her property boundary at strangely irregular hours, drivers who appeared excessively interested in photographing her gate for people who insisted they were merely confused tourists. She responded the way her grandfather once responded to coyotes prowling too close to the chicken coop on winter nights, not with alarm or confrontation, but with calm, methodical preparation. She installed motion-activated cameras along the entire property line, positioned sensors near the gate and along the tree line, and purchased a small surveillance drone that she learned to operate within a single focused weekend. Within weeks, her quiet canyon had quietly become one of the most thoroughly monitored private properties in the entire region, though nobody beyond her boundaries had any awareness this had occurred. Marcus's composure finally shattered entirely during a heated phone conversation that Claire recorded with complete knowledge of state statutes explicitly permitting it. His voice escalated beyond its usual controlled professional tone as he warned her that continued obstinacy would result in repercussions far exceeding simple paperwork, concluding the call with a statement that sounded less like standard business language and far more like an outright threat. "If you refuse to cooperate, you will deeply regret this decision." Claire ended the call, looked out across the wide shadowed valley, and felt something solidify quietly in her chest. Not fear precisely, but a calm, focused certainty that whatever developed next would require every ounce of patience her grandfather had ever demonstrated during all those long years on the canyon. The intrusion occurred at 3:00 in the morning, precisely the kind of hour people select when they assume with complete confidence that nobody could conceivably be monitoring them. Claire's cameras captured 3 figures dressed in dark clothing moving deliberately along the fence line near the gate, carrying bolt cutters and a cordless angle grinder obviously intended for the reinforced chain securing the entrance. One wore a vest labeled Canyon Access Compliance Team, an entity that existed nowhere in any official registry, fabricated purely to appear legitimate enough to confuse anyone who might notice it briefly. Claire did not rush outside confrontationally because her grandfather had taught her long ago that direct confrontation in darkness rarely concludes favorably, even when you are entirely justified. Instead, she remained inside calmly recording everything from multiple stable angles while contacting the county sheriff directly rather than wasting precious time on a general dispatch line. She provided calm, specific directions, described the vehicle parked near the lower curve, and waited with the kind of patience that had gradually become her defining characteristic throughout this entire protracted dispute. The sheriff's department arrived faster than most expected, intercepting all 3 intruders still actively working on the lock, tools still gripped in their hands, headlamps still illuminating their immediate surroundings. They were arrested immediately on site, charged with attempted criminal trespass and possession of burglary instruments, their fabricated official vests carefully photographed and entered into the evidence log. Under minimal questioning at the scene, one of them uttered a sentence that would prove far more significant later than it appeared that particular night. Marcus assured us we would be protected, that charges would never actually materialize. That single unguarded statement, documented plainly in an officer's incident report, initiated an investigation that would eventually unravel everything Marcus Brennan had spent years carefully constructing for himself. Sheriff Linda Vasquez, a sharp woman who had served this county for over 15 years and remembered Thomas Donovan personally from community gatherings decades earlier, inspected the property herself the following afternoon, examining the damaged fence sections and the abandoned grinder left behind in the hasty retreat. She told Claire directly that she had witnessed numerous property conflicts throughout her tenure, but rarely one escalating this rapidly or this recklessly, and she assured her the investigation would proceed exactly as far as the evidence justified, regardless of who ultimately appeared in it. That assurance, delivered standing in the bright afternoon sun beside the severed lock, would prove critically important in the months ahead. A formal criminal inquiry began within a week, focused initially on the 3 individuals apprehended directly at the gate, but quietly expanding to examine precisely who had dispatched them up that canyon initially. For the first time since this entire conflict began, the burden of accountability shifted noticeably away from Claire and toward the people who had foolishly believed money could purchase permanent immunity. Public sentiment, however, did not shift quite so immediately, because Marcus still controlled the dominant narrative long before anyone outside Clearwater Ridge heard an alternative account. He launched a public relations campaign accusing Claire of recklessly endangering the entire community, circulating professional flyers throughout the development that portrayed her as a dangerous recluse deliberately obstructing emergency access from pure selfishness. A slick website materialized within days, featuring a dramatic timer and a tagline repeated across every page in bold capital letters: "Open the road." The association organized a demonstration at the canyon's base, assembling roughly 40 residents holding printed signs, chanting phrases loosely borrowed from movements that bore absolutely no connection to private property rights or canyon easements. Claire responded in the only manner that genuinely matched her temperament, by carrying a folding chair down near the gate and sitting calmly to observe the entire performance unfold like someone patiently watching a community play she had not requested tickets for. When a journalist from the regional newspaper asked for her candid response to the demonstration, Claire delivered the line that would subsequently appear quoted in 4 separate news stories across the region. Generous 6 out of 10. Could use better choreography. A young organizer holding a bullhorn attempted to rally the crowd back into synchronization, repeating the same 2 chants repeatedly until even her fellow residents stopped echoing them with her. Someone's handmade poster toppled over in the breeze and nobody bothered retrieving it, which communicated to Claire everything she needed to understand about how genuinely anyone believed in what they were shouting. She sipped her tea, recorded nothing herself, and simply waited for the inevitable moment a reporter would wander close enough to ask her directly what she thought of the whole spectacle. The crowd's frustration intensified considerably after that remark circulated through the development, because nothing aggravates manufactured indignation quite like someone declining to acknowledge it seriously before cameras. One resident in a polo shirt bearing the Clearwater Ridge logo shouted that Claire should feel ashamed for mocking her own neighbors, though Claire simply raised her mug in a small acknowledgement and offered nothing further, which somehow irritated the gathering even more than an actual response would have. Within the same week, a man claiming to be a casual hiker collapsed dramatically near Claire's gate in front of a small assembled crowd, shouting loudly that Claire had physically assaulted him unprovoked on her own private land. Cameras from the demonstration immediately pivoted toward the gate, capturing what appeared, for one brief tense moment, like genuine violence unfolding on recorded footage. What none of the demonstrators realized in that instant was that Claire's own security camera, positioned just above the gate at a deliberate angle, had captured the entire incident from a clear, completely unobstructed perspective. The footage unmistakably showed the man stumbling backward intentionally, throwing himself onto the gravel without ever actually being contacted, in a performance that might have succeeded convincingly on a theater stage but failed entirely under a fixed, unblinking recording device. Within 36 hours, the footage reached both the sheriff's department and the regional news outlet, exposing the staged attack for exactly what it always was. The man was arrested for filing a fraudulent police report, and under direct questioning, he confessed that he had been compensated $1,500 by someone affiliated closely with the association to stage the entire confrontation for the cameras. That specific detail did not appear anywhere in Marcus's official press releases, but it appeared everywhere else instead, circulating through the valley with the kind of velocity that only profoundly embarrassing revelations seem to achieve. For the first time, Marcus Brennan began to genuinely comprehend that the canyon woman he once dismissed as simple and easily manipulated was proving far more difficult to outmaneuver than he had ever seriously considered. The escalation that followed violated a boundary even Marcus's harshest detractors had not fully anticipated him crossing. One quiet morning, Claire woke to the grinding sound of diesel engines laboring up the lower section of her own land, where a bulldozer and a grader had already begun clearing vegetation along the edge of her property without any advance notice whatsoever. When she confronted the crew directly, walking down in her work boots with her mug still in hand, they informed her without hesitation that they had been contracted by the Clearwater Ridge Community Association to begin grading an entirely new access corridor through her land. Claire did not raise her voice because raising her voice had never once accomplished anything meaningful on this canyon in her entire life. Instead, she contacted the sheriff's department again, then the county zoning office, and finally the code enforcement division, explaining exactly what was occurring in calm, precise, almost clinical detail. Within hours, officials arrived to discover heavy equipment operating without permits, without an approved site plan, and without a single fragment of legal authorization to disturb land that belonged on paper and an indisputable fact entirely to Claire Donovan alone. The county code enforcement officer, a meticulous man named Raymond Torres who rarely displayed emotion even when standing before an operating bulldozer, walked the disturbed ground with a tablet, cross-referencing it against the official parcel records maintained at the courthouse. He shook his head repeatedly, commenting that he had genuinely never witnessed a development attempt grading operations on private land without so much as a preliminary phone call to the owner. By early afternoon, the entire site had been cordoned off with barrier tape, the machinery silenced, and the workers standing around uncertainly with their hands in their pockets, awaiting instructions nobody seemed prepared to provide anymore. The construction was halted immediately, the equipment impounded directly on location, and the contracting firm fined substantially for operating without proper authorization on clearly designated private property. When investigators inquired who precisely had retained them, the answer traced directly back to a private contract executed under Marcus's own authority as association president, completely circumventing the board's mandatory approval procedures. It was the clearest indication yet that this conflict had ceased being a simple misunderstanding long ago, and had evolved into something far closer to a coordinated assault against one woman's land and one family's heritage. Standing at the edge of the torn vegetation that evening, observing deep equipment tracks carved into the ground her grandfather once cleared patiently by hand decades earlier, Claire finally permitted herself a single quiet, sobering realization. This was no longer a disagreement between neighbors who simply perceived things differently. This was a campaign being waged with someone else's resources, someone else's hired contractors, and someone else's absolute disregard for the law and for fundamental decency. The pivotal moment arrived quietly, the way most genuinely significant pivotal moments tend to arrive, through a hesitant knock on Claire's door rather than any dramatic courtroom pronouncement. Stephen Ortiz stood on the porch that evening, the official secretary of the Clearwater Ridge Community Association, a man Claire had only ever observed from a distance during meetings she had never personally attended. Stephen looked exhausted in that very particular way people look when they have been carrying a burdensome secret for far too long without anyone to share the load. He arrived carrying a thumb drive, a thick binder of printed correspondence, and a stack of receipts that told a story Marcus had spent months carefully attempting to conceal beneath official-sounding terminology. According to those documents, Marcus had quietly authorized expenditures totaling $280,000 from association reserve accounts, none of it ever approved by the actual board or disclosed to residents during standard financial briefings. The funds had gone toward private legal representation retained entirely outside normal procedures, a so-called security firm responsible for the gate intrusion, a paid performer used in the staged assault near the gate, and unauthorized construction teams dispatched directly onto Claire's land without a single valid authorization. Stephen explained, in a voice barely audible beyond the creaking porch boards, that he had grown genuinely terrified of being implicated for decisions he never personally endorsed, decisions that could readily be connected to his own signature on certain authorization forms he had signed without thoroughly reviewing. He mentioned, almost parenthetically, that he had twin sons beginning high school applications that fall, and the prospect of his own name appearing in a criminal indictment had kept him awake more nights than he cared to acknowledge aloud. He had spent weeks quietly compiling evidence, not entirely from loyalty to Claire, but from a desperate, profoundly human need to shield himself from prosecution for offenses orchestrated almost entirely by someone else's ambition. Surrendering the thumb drive felt, in his own quiet words, like finally releasing a burden he could no longer physically sustain alone. Claire listened without interrupting once, the same deep patience that had sustained her through every previous confrontation now serving a far more critical purpose than it ever had before. She thanked Stephen calmly, assured him she would handle the evidence with appropriate discretion, and understood immediately that this entire conflict had just shifted onto completely different terrain. The canyon woman on the ridge no longer needed to simply defend herself against false accusations. She now possessed evidence capable of ending Marcus Brennan's tenure long before a single judge ever spoke his name aloud in a courtroom. Rather than rushing immediately toward litigation, Claire selected a different initial approach entirely, one informed by years of watching her grandfather resolve conflicts through straightforward, honest transparency rather than legal maneuvering or strategic calculation. She organized what she simply called a Canyon Community Information Session, inviting residents from Clearwater Ridge, local journalists, and several county officials to gather at the base of the road, where this entire conflict had first originated months earlier. Tables were arranged beneath a simple canvas canopy displaying clear copies of her original property deed, decades of continuous tax documentation, and surveyed maps proving exactly where her boundaries had always existed long before anyone constructed a single residence below. Beside the legal documents sat printed transcripts of threatening phone conversations, security footage of the attempted intrusion, and the staged assault recorded clearly from multiple stable angles for anyone willing to examine closely. Spreadsheets detailing the $280,000 in misappropriated funds were displayed plainly across the table, annotated carefully with dates, authorizations, and the names of contractors who had been compensated generously to harass one woman for simply declining to sell her own land. Journalists from 3 local outlets walked slowly along the tables, cameras recording steadily, posing questions that finally received genuine documented responses instead of rehearsed association talking points repeated for months. Residents who had once demonstrated passionately with signs demanding the road be opened now stood quietly reading documents that told a profoundly different story than the one Marcus had been providing them for months without challenge. Some visibly paled as they recognized their own association dues listed plainly among the misused funds, money they had contributed in good faith toward amenities and security, not clandestine contractors and carefully orchestrated offenses against an innocent neighbor. One by one, neighbors who had shouted angrily outside Claire's gate now approached her directly, offering quiet, somewhat uncomfortable apologies for believing a narrative constructed entirely on someone else's deliberate fabrications. By the conclusion of that single long afternoon, public opinion across the entire valley had completely inverted itself, no longer characterizing Claire as an obstinate obstacle, but as a woman who had been speaking the simple truth from the very beginning of this whole ordeal. Regional headlines shifted almost immediately, quietly replacing terms like reckless and selfish with terms like vindicated and profoundly wronged. Marcus Brennan, once unavoidable at any community gathering, ceased attending entirely after that day, his sudden absence communicating far more powerfully than any carefully worded statement his attorneys could have composed on his behalf. The lawsuit Marcus had once confidently threatened finally reached a courtroom, though by then the entire framework of the case had shifted dramatically and irreversibly in Claire's favor. The community association, still technically pursuing legal access to her private road, found itself instead defending decisions that had quietly become widespread undeniable knowledge across the entire valley. Claire's attorney constructed the case methodically, element by element, presenting the original property deed from 1958 alongside continuous, unbroken tax documentation proving 65 full years of family ownership without a single gap. Security footage from the attempted intrusion played deliberately for the courtroom, followed immediately by the staged assault recording that had already circulated through regional news months earlier. Financial records detailing the $280,000 in misappropriated funds were entered formally into evidence, each individual transaction traced carefully back to authorizations bearing Marcus Brennan's own personal signature. When the ruling finally arrived, it came without much genuine suspense remaining in the room because the documented facts had long since rendered the eventual outcome obvious to everyone present, except perhaps Marcus himself. The court dismissed the community association's claim to any access rights over Claire's private land, firmly confirming exactly what the original deed had stated all along without ambiguity. Beyond the simple dismissal, the judge formally referred the financial misconduct, the unauthorized construction activity, and the staged criminal conduct directly to the district attorney's office for further, more serious criminal proceedings. Marcus sat almost entirely motionless as the lengthy ruling was read aloud, his carefully maintained composure finally collapsing entirely into something that resembled quiet, complete defeat. In the weeks following the ruling, Marcus Brennan was formally arrested at his own residence, facing serious charges that included fraud, conspiracy to commit criminal trespass, and falsification of official records tied directly to the unauthorized construction permits he had personally executed. The community association he had built his entire public identity around was dissolved entirely soon afterward, replaced by a newly elected board determined to carefully restore both its damaged finances and its tarnished reputation among residents who felt genuinely betrayed by everything that had quietly transpired behind closed doors. Stephen Ortiz, once deeply afraid of being blamed for decisions he never personally endorsed, was fully and publicly cleared of any wrongdoing, his courageous cooperation widely credited across the valley with bringing the entire elaborate scheme into the light at last. Throughout the following weeks, a steady, almost uninterrupted stream of Clearwater Ridge residents made the long drive up to Claire's gate, offering apologies that ranged from a simple, respectful nod to extended, somewhat awkward conversations on her quiet porch. She accepted each one without any genuine bitterness, because holding onto resentment had never been part of how her grandfather raised her to handle people who eventually, in their own time, arrived at the truth of the matter. Gradually, the canyon returned to something closely resembling its old, familiar rhythm, though Claire made a few permanent modifications that reflected everything the past several difficult months had quietly taught her about the world below. She installed a substantially heavier steel gate at the base of her road, reinforced with the same quiet determination her grandfather once used to carve that very path by hand decades earlier under a different summer sky. Beside it, she mounted a new sign, straightforward in its basic design but completely unmistakable in its enduring meaning, the words painted carefully in bold black letters across a weathered wooden plank that would likely outlast them all. Private property. Not happening. Not ever. On a quiet evening not long after the dust had finally settled across the valley, Claire climbed slowly to the highest point on her ridge, the same precise spot where her grandfather used to stand for extended periods and watch the sun descend behind the distant western peaks. Below her, the lights of Clearwater Ridge flickered gently on one by one, distant and entirely harmless now, no longer feeling like any kind of threat, but simply another part of the wide landscape her family had always quietly shared the valley with, whether anyone below realized it or not. She thought of her grandfather's worn, patient hands, swinging that old pickaxe through rock that refused to yield easily, building something clearly intended to endure far longer than any single human lifetime ever could. Boundaries matter, her grandfather used to say plainly, though he rarely bothered explaining exactly why, trusting instead that Claire would eventually comprehend the deeper lesson through difficult experience rather than simple explanation. Standing there at dusk, mug still warm in her weathered hand, Claire finally understood that old lesson completely in a way that felt almost physical in her chest. Land remembers who actually built it, who genuinely defended it through adversity, and who simply attempted to claim it without ever earning a single honest inch of it. She looked once more across the wide, darkening valley, watching the last warm light spill gold across the ridges her family had proudly called home for 65 full years, and allowed herself a small, genuine, quiet smile. Some things, she thought to herself, are worth defending, not because the fight itself is ever easy, but because walking away from them entirely would have meant losing something far larger and far more important than mere land alone. The canyon stayed silent and steady around her, patient as it had always been, exactly the way her grandfather had quietly taught her to be through every season of her life.